The optimistic bias, also known as comparative or unrealistic optimism, is a cognitive disorder that causes someone to underestimate the likelihood of experiencing an unwanted situation. This bias is prevalent across all social groups, regardless of sex, age, ethnicity, or nationality, affecting both humans and some animals, however. It seems to affect the autistic population less. People often exhibit optimistic bias due to a combination of factors, including their desired outcome, cognitive functioning, self-awareness versus awareness of others, and general mood. This bias manifests in various scenarios. People may feel less risk of becoming a crime victim, or smokers may perceive a lower risk of getting lung cancer than others. Furthermore, first-time bungee jumpers may feel less inclined to injury than other jumpers, or traders may perceive they have lesser risk of market losses. Optimistic bias extends to both positive and negative eventualities. However, a significant volume of research establishes that the bias is more substantial when dealing with negative possibilities known as the valence effect. Positive occurrences often elevate feelings of well-being and self-esteem, while negative ones increase the likelihood of risk, prone behaviors, and negligence of safety measures. We can dissect factors that contribute to the optimistic bias under 4 categories: desired end states of comparative judgment, cognitive mechanisms, self-Vs, target information, and effect. To measure optimistic bias, researchers use 2 risk components, absolute and comparative. They measure absolute risk by asking individuals their chances of experiencing negative events compared to their actual likelihood. Determining absolute risk is tricky due to the difficulty in ascertaining the precise risk statistics for individuals. Conversely, comparative risk, the prevalent measure of optimistic bias, involves individuals assessing their personal risk against others of the same gender and age. The assurance of this measure lies in people's propensity to compare themselves against others, either directly or indirectly. Research indicates that the optimistic bias, which refers to the tendency of individuals to overestimate positive outcomes and underestimate negative ones, stems from over-evaluating risks associated with groups rather than under-evaluating personal risks. An instance of this is when study participants were more likely to predict a higher chance for drawing a card with a smiling face on it, compared to one with a frowning face. 3 cognitive tools potentially sway the optimistic bias: representativeness heuristic, singular target focus, and relational proximity. The perceived probability attached to the optimistic bias depends on how much an event aligns with an individual's concept of the event. Some scholars propose people's tendency to think in stereotypes, known as representativeness heuristic, fuels this bias. For instance, in a road accident scenario, respondents are likely to connect a terrible driver rather than an ordinary one. The comparison, hence, deviates more towards the negative aspects rather than a proper overall evaluation between them and another driver. Likewise, when individuals compare themselves with friends, they pick friends who seem more susceptible to the given circumstance. A chosen friend often resembles the given example, which leads to the creation of representativeness heuristics. One of the complexities associated with the optimistic bias is the lack of understanding individuals have about others in comparison to themselves. While people comprehend their unique personality, they tend to generalize others, leading to skewed deviations and incapabilities to truly grasp their comparative group. Similarly, when assessing risks, people often overlook an average person, focusing more on personal emotions and experiences. It's also noticed that believed risk variations depend heavily on the comparative target's proximity. The more distant the target seems, the greater the perceived risk difference. On bringing a comparative target closer, perceived risks appear to blend more than with a distant comparison target. This connection between perceived social distance and optimistic bias suggests more similarities perceived when inter-group comparisons are made, while outer-group comparisons cause perceived differences. In a study illustrating this, participants judged 2 contrasting comparison targets: A typical student from their university and another university. The manipulation of the social contexts of these groups established a vital connection between social distance and optimistic bias. The theme of this story centers around the concept of optimistic bias, the propensity for individuals to believe they are less at risk or more likely to experience positive outcomes than their counterparts. This tendency is fueled by various factors such as self-enhancement, self-representation, and perceived control. In essence, individuals often engage in self-enhancement by predicting favorable outcomes as it promotes positivity and diminishes stress and anxiety. They actively seek information that aligns with their optimistic expectations rather than harsh realities. This natural tendency to look at the brighter side of things makes them downplay their risks, hence projecting themselves in a comparatively better light. Another critical aspect that fuels optimistic bias is self-representation. People inherently wish to present an admirable image of themselves to others. The optimistic bias is thus viewed as an unconscious self-representation instrument. People desire to appear prosperous and less at risk than others. Studies show that those who display optimism are generally more socially acceptable, contributing further to the prevalence of optimistic bias. Perceived control is another contributing factor to the optimistic bias. People tend to be more hopeful when they feel they have control over a situation. For instance, individuals often perceive their chances of getting into car accidents as low when they're driving, as opposed to when others are similarly. Believing they have control over contracting diseases also results in underestimating the potential risks involved. Further research, such as a meta-analysis, discovered a consistent relationship between perceived control and optimistic bias, moderated by several factors. Intriguingly, these effects appeared to be more prominent among participants from the United States compared to other nations. The higher level of optimistic bias among these participants anchors to this perceived control. People usually have a wealth of knowledge about themselves, but are often ill-informed about others. This imbalance of information fuels biased judgments about personal versus others' risks, magnifying the optimistic bias gap. The positivity bias, a phenomenon where we view objects more favorably the more they resemble humans, directly impacts assessments. An average person, despite being of the same sex or age, is generally less humanized and hence not favored in comparisons. The term egocentric thinking entails people's usage of their personal information and risks to form judgments and make decisions. A scarcity of detailed knowledge about others prompts them to rely on less personal data like population statistics. This reliance can perpetuate optimistic bias on account of inadequate comprehension of precise information about others. Escaping egocentric thinking is conceivable, though. Research demonstrates that increased knowledge about others curtails optimistic bias, suggesting that bringing a comparison group closer to the subject smoothens the bias. Lastly, people might underestimate others' control over their own outcomes. One example being smokers who think they are unique in their precautionary measures against lung cancer. Such miscalculations occur either because people overlook others' autonomy or believe they are not exercising it properly. Either way, these erroneous conclusions amplify the gap in optimistic bias. The impact of optimistic bias on health-related decision-making is a key focus of research, as an overconfident outlook may often deter individuals from adapting preventative health behaviors, such as a balanced diet or regular exercise. Those who underestimate their chances of developing conditions like heart disease, even after being informed about the disease, still display less concern about its risks. The phenomenon of optimistic bias, therefore, directly influences risk perception and ultimately dictates the measures taken. Towards preventing health risks, therefore, it's crucial for researchers to be cognizant of this, to further analyze its role in influencing life decisions. Optimistic bias often tends to escalate during adolescence, a time associated with an uptick in risky health-related behavior indulged like smoking, drug use, and unprotected sex. Conversely, awareness of associated risks among adolescents doesn't necessarily translate into behavior change. Positive optimistic bias towards risky behaviors actually intensifies with age among this group of youth. However, research on this phenomenon occasionally encounters obstacles. One example is the continuous use of unconditional risk questions in cross-sectional studies, which create limitations as they simply determine the probability of a particular event without comparing outcomes or contrasting events that did and didn't occur. Furthermore, understanding individual perceptions of risk can be crucial in future research concerning optimistic bias in preventative behavior. In relation to the neuroscience behind the optimistic bias, functional neuroimaging reveals that the rostral anterior cingulate cortex (AC) plays a significant role in modulating emotional processing and autobiographical retrieval. More specifically, it is suggested that the rostral ACC contributes to creating positive future visions, thereby fostering the optimistic bias. The optimistic bias extends beyond health and impacts various aspects of life decisions, planning, and management. Often, optimism bias leads to an underestimation of costs and time requirements and amplifies predicted benefits for planned projects. Coined as planning fallacy by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, this optimism bias has been identified as one of the major reasons for overshooting budgets in large-scale projects. The concept of valence effects or cognitive bias casts a significant impact on several real-world scenarios. For instance, this bias tendency often results in investors overestimating a company's future profits, subsequently leading to an inflated market price. In organizational behavior, this may inspire the creation of unrealistic timelines, propelling the planning fallacy, which often ends in subpar decision-making and project abandonment. Studies indicate that this optimism bias is stubbornly persistent. Efforts to minimize it, ironically, often result in even more optimism bias. Despite numerous trials involving lists of risk factors, self-deprecation, thinking of high-risk personalities, and understanding why they are at risk, the bias increases rather than diminishes. Attempts to decrease the bias by shortening the distance have likewise failed to eliminate the bias effectively. This counterproductive situation mirrors Hofstadter's law, a self-nesting rule stating, "It always takes longer than you expect, even when you take into account Hofstadter's law." Various factors, nonetheless, can assist in bridging the gap caused by optimism bias. First, if the comparison group is close to the individual, this can significantly curb optimism bias. Studies show almost no disparity in the event probability when individuals compare themselves with their close friends. Furthermore, personal experience of an event considerably lessens the optimism bias. Awareness of a hitherto unknown significantly diminishes the likelihood of naively ignoring its potential occurrence. The antithesis of optimism bias is the pessimism bias, where individuals perceive themselves as worse off than others. This could be a personal distortion view, representing personal optimism, or an altered view of others, indicating personal pessimism. Pessimism bias illustrates an individual's amplified probability of undesirable outcomes. Particularly, individuals with depression have shown a tendency to exhibit a pessimism bias. Smokers also showed a minor yet significant pessimism bias in their prediction of heart disease risk rate, although findings in this field are generally contradictory.